Hello, 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 hello. Welcome, everybody. If you're just walking in, know that the first row is not reserved for the wedding party. You can sit in the front row as well. That's fine. Welcome to the Humanities Forum. My name is Ian Bernhoft. I direct the Humanities Forum. Usually it takes place on Fridays in Rouen 105. This week we're doing something different. Really glad you could make it out. Let me give you my spiel, my pitch, and then I'm going to turn the microphone over. So, if you don't know anything about the Humanities Forum, all you need to know is that it's an initiative of the Humanities Program. It's an opportunity for the Providence College campus to come together, to hear from scholars and journalists and writers from around the world, to encounter new ideas, and to deepen our appreciation for the humanities. Today's event is happening in collaboration with the Dialogue, Inclusion, and Democracy Lab, or the DID Lab, funding for which is made possible by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundation. And the way things are going to go is, more or less, is you'll hear our speaker will be introduced. She's going to give a talk, may ask you questions during the talk, so be on your toes. But then towards the end, there will be probably about 20 minutes or so for questions and answers, and we're going to wrap up right around 5:15. At which point, there's a little reception in the back, which some of our more ambitious students have already hit up. But you can also wait until 5:15 as well if you want. But anyway, we hope you can linger, chat with each other, further the conversation, etc. Okay. I would encourage you, if possible, to close those screens down so that you can be more present to what's happening in the room. And with that, I want to turn the microphone over to one of the DID Lab fellows, Sophia Lamas, who will be introducing our speaker.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As stated earlier, my name is Sophia Lamas, and I'm currently a senior here at Providence College, and as well as a DID fellow. DID, or Dialogue, Inclusion, and Democracy, is a fellowship that aims to engage student leadership in fulfilling PC's mission of fostering dialogue and critical engagement with the community and also the world. Our goal is to promote civic engagement and, of course, collaborative co-creation across diverse perspectives. We're passionate about cultivating this spirit across all individuals to build a beloved and an inclusive community. That's why we're incredibly honored and grateful to have Allison Briscoe-Smith with us today and hear her own presentation on how we can make this a such beloved community on PC's campus. Allison Briscoe-Smith earned her undergraduate degree from Harvard University and her clinical psychology PhD from University of California, Berkeley. She then went on to continue her specialization in trauma and ethnic minority mental health through internship and postdoctoral work at University of California, San Francisco and San Francisco General Hospital. She has combined her love of teaching and advocacy by serving as a professor, by directing mental health programs for children experiencing trauma, homelessness, or foster care, and developing her own consultancy. Much of her work been with schools, higher ed, philanthropy, and healthcare organizations as a clinician, consultant, and trainer. She also provides training and consultation to organizations and systems determined to create spaces of healing and belonging. The opportunities for her to serve have included everything from consulting with children's media to providing coaching to executives in large organizations. She currently serves as the diversity lead of student life at the University of Washington, as the founder and principal of Soft River Consultation, and as a senior fellow at UC Berkeley Greater Good Science Center, where she focuses on developing and implementing the science of bridging, connecting across our differences. And with great honor, I'm so grateful to read about with her. Let's welcome Allison Briscoe-Smith.
Thank you. I'm going to use this. Thank you. Hello and good afternoon. Is that too loud? Is that right? Hi, good afternoon. I'm really excited to be here and just want to thank Nick and the D.E.I Lab for having me here and the forum for having this opportunity to be with you all. So I'm going to get a chance to talk about a couple of different things today, and there we go. And namely, if this works, I'm going to get a chance to talk to you about three main kind of concepts. And I should mention that the way that I'm going to do this is that there will be turn and talks. You will have to talk to the person next to you. I won't make you stand up or get around, but we are going to turn to each other because this is about creating community. So we're going to talk about a couple different things, one of which is belonging and the social science of belonging, like what is it really and how can we kind of foster it. The other is I want to hear from you all about what beloved community is, what it means to you, take you through a little bit of the history of the concept, and then if we have time, because I tend to talk a whole lot, we're going to move to some of the science around bridging differences. Throughout all of this, I'm going to be kind of paying attention to and listening for conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and try to highlight those. So that's my hope for today, and the main thing from the lovely introduction that was provided, I'm a child psychologist. That's where I come from, that's my kind of perspective, and sometimes people are curious about how a child psychologist ends up doing a lot of work around like bridging differences or difficult dialogue, but we all have one thing I think in common, which is how many of you were ever children, right? So that's my foundation, is that we all were children at some point. A lot of the stuff I'm going to present are basically like the social, emotional learning kind of components, the real basic components about how we might be able to be in conversation with folks. I am looking forward to hearing from you all and the other leaders in the field and the space about how to do more complex dialogue and argumentation, but I'm going to keep it pretty basic. So for us to start, the very first thing I would like to encourage us to do is start with this idea of belonging. So I'd like to invite you to turn to a person next to you. Great if you know them, but if you want to, expand your circle, you can do that. But can you talk just a little bit about what belonging is, what it means to you? How do you know if you belong? So turn real quick to each other. What is belonging? What does it mean? So just about one more minute in your groups. All right, I'm going to go ahead and interrupt the great conversations. For the purposes of this kind of shout out, what I'm going to do is I'll repeat what you said, so that's both a way for me to make sure I got it, but also for the recording. But when we get to the longer kind of questions, I'll go ahead and pass the mic, if that's okay. So let's just begin with, what does belonging mean to you? Thoughts, ideas, what comes up? Yes? Feeling engaged and being your most authentic self. Wonderful, great place for us to start. Yes? Feeling comfortable, safe, included. Beautiful. What else we got? Yes?
Feeling respected and supported around us.
Feeling respected and supported. Wonderful.
And if you belong somewhere, you usually have like a role.
If you belong somewhere, then you feel like you have a role, right? These are all wonderful definitions. Yes?
I was just going to say a place where code switching is unnecessary.
A place where code switching is unnecessary. That to me speaks to, as what has been raised here, the idea that we can be our whole selves. It might be a place of rest. So we were talking about what it feels like, but we also have to think a little bit about what are the places that allow us to belong. And so there's lots of different kinds of definitions. It bounces around within the research, but it's also one of these pieces that we really feel. We feel the sense of belonging, feel the sense of not belonging as well. That's something that we can kind of feel. Brene Brown talks about kind of the opposite of belonging, and the opposite of belonging is the need to fit in. The need to kind of constrain or alter pieces of ourselves in order to be accepted. So maybe, like was kind of mentioned, the idea that I've got to switch codes, I've got to change it up a bit. So why is this concept so important? It's really important because as we think about kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, so we think about like food, water, actually belonging is one of the foundational pieces. The idea of psychological safety and community and engagement. But it also is this idea that really animates a lot of what goes on in schools, a lot of what goes on for kids as we kind of grow up. Do I belong here? But also turns out to be a place that we can actually influence and has some really powerful outcome. So I want to show you a couple different definitions. There are two main theorists that I'm going to operate from or pull from. They're both social psychologists at Stanford. Well, actually, I don't know if Walton's at Stanford, but Jeffrey Cohen's at Stanford, and Gregory Walton is the other theorist. And they're researchers that do a lot of work on belonging. And I'm going to take you through a couple of pieces here. But they basically say that all of us as people often enter into spaces thinking about these key questions. Do I belong here? Do I have anything in common with people here? Can I be me here? That these are animating questions that we're asking at some level as we enter into spaces. And then I wanted to pull from another way of thinking about this, which is a definition offered by University of California, San Francisco. So in their work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, they've had a little bit of a shift to really focus on belonging, which is interesting as a hospital is taking a look at a shift towards belonging, because they actually felt that it was important for their health. And so they have a definition that's long, but I'm going to read it, which is belonging is an individual internal experience, a sense of oneself in relation to a community, organization, or institution. An individual's sense of belonging is supported by the demonstration of inclusion, from being acknowledged when passing in hallways to seeing one image reflected in marketing and tangible opportunities for everybody to participate and contribute. It's complicated. This is a big definition, but I like it because it's a couple different things, one of which talks about our own internal experience, but it also then talks about what systems can do to signal belonging. What an actual school could do or a hospital could do. They talk about how it's actually really important to kind of signal that people are welcome there and would like to participate there. So I used to run a healthcare for a homeless organization at Children's Hospital Oakland, and we had a rebuild of the building. And one of the things that we did is we had this word wall that was in all the modal languages, all 27 modal languages that we saw within the Oakland community. And it all said welcome, but in the different ways. But that was something that was really purposeful to signal meaning and to signal a sense of belonging. It's also the other part about, as was mentioned before, the opportunity to contribute. That wall wasn't created just by me, it was created by other students and other actually patients that we had in the space that talked about what was really meaningful. So I like this definition because it talks about not only what's internal, but what we can kind of do as an organization. Now, people may have seen belonging kind of signaled or become a thing in other places. So there's a little bit of a caveat, which is that this is kind of caught speed. And the worry that I have with it kind of catching speed is that it becomes kind of ubiquitous everywhere. So there's a paper that Cohen has, which is called Stop Shouting You Belong at Everybody. So I don't know if you all have kind of seen this. So I was new to the Pacific Northwest. In the Bay Area where I lived for about 20 years, we didn't have a whole lot of indoor malls, but in Seattle, you kind of need them because it rains all the time. And so I went to a mall, and at the mall were big signs everywhere. You belong, you belong, you belong at the mall. And that kind of caught me, like, I don't know if I need to belong to Abercrombie & Fitch or to Macy's or whatever. It's becoming a little bit kind of commodified. I don't know if folks have seen that or noticed it. So one of the things that we want to kind of caution is that just yelling you belong is not the same as genuine engagement and genuine signaling that you belong. So just the button or the pin or that's on the wall or even the word wall that I'm talking about may not just be it. So we're going to toggle back and forth between these ideas. But let's talk a little bit about why belonging is kind of showing up within the psychological research. It turns out that the research on this is really burgeoning and turning out to be pretty good. That when kids or when students or people don't have a sense of belonging, it's related to things like disciplinary outcomes, school, academic achievement, and life satisfaction. And conversely, they found that when we kind of make some changes on these kinds of things, that it can actually be really helpful. So I'm going to talk to you about one particular type of research that has actually been showing up a lot here. So Walton and Cohen were doing a bunch of this research at Stanford University. They're part of kind of a research group and lab there that does a lot of work on what's called WISE interventions, social psychological interventions that are relatively small tweaks that actually end up being really powerful. So they were really interested in part of kind of a community there of identifying and figuring out what could be done to support students who were not feeling a sense of belonging. So they worked with, in particular, African-American students at Stanford. So Stanford's a predominantly white institution. The population of African-American students was pretty low. There were a number of kind of alternate and not so great kind of outcome for their students. So they decided to do an intervention. So they did a belonging intervention with the black students, and then it turns out 4 years later that the black students who had received the intervention had higher GPAs and higher rates of graduation. They followed those same students both 7 years and 11 years later, and those students who received the belonging intervention were more likely to have higher rates of job satisfaction and overall life satisfaction. So this is a pretty powerful, and they've replicated this a number of times. They've actually done this across a number of different organizations, and finds out that when they do this intervention, it has big impact. So you might be curious, what was this radical intervention that they did? The intervention was a 45-minute intervention done at orientation. The students read a little blurb that was ostensibly written by an older black student, and they told them the 3 following things. Transitions in college are difficult, it won't last forever, and it's not about you. Those 3 things. Transitions are hard, they don't last forever, and it says nothing about who you are as a person. That was the only intervention. I don't know how you all feel about that, but I'm pretty wowed that a 45-minute reading intervention translates into GPA, graduation, and overall life satisfaction. So there's a couple pieces to this. Why does that work? The idea with WISE interventions is what it did is it allowed students a couple different things. It allowed them to kind of interpret the experiences that they had slightly different than people that didn't have it. Because it turns out they actually measured the experiences of the students and found out that the students with and without the intervention experienced the same high levels of racism. So it wasn't as if they weren't being subject to issues or stressors, but their interpretation about why that was happening to them and their ability to navigate that was really different. So this is pretty interesting and kind of pretty radical, and also a little bit problematic. Because the way I'd like to think about it is, what if the students actually felt like they belonged because the institution helped them belong? I get a little bit worried where the idea is just that I have to change my perspective and that the system doesn't change. But we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Again, pretty small, kind of radical piece that has big interventions. Now, they've got a lot of things like this, a lot of places around creating this kind of sense of belonging that turns out to be pretty impactful. I'm going to pause and just see, are there any questions or thoughts before I go on there? Okay, we'll come on back to that. So there's a number of different ways and strategies that you can kind of do this creation of belonging. One of the things is that it needs to be well-timed. That the interventions that they found, that it was most helpful to have that type of intervention happen at orientation or happen as students were starting. It's also really important to kind of have these types of interventions happen when people are experiencing stress or big transitions. So they've got to be well-timed. There's also this opportunity to kind of think about situation crafting, meaning this has to happen in a time and space where students feel like they can actually, talk to someone about this experience or read about this experience, or it has to be kind of a situation that's well-crafted. Also, the things that we find within terms of the research is that giving people an opportunity to feel really heard or supportive really helps. There's this idea around perspective getting, which is basically this idea, it's not just kind of perspective taking, it's the idea of telling elaborate stories. So these are just some highlights with the research. And then this piece around values affirmation is another really interesting kind of piece that I want to talk just a little bit about. So this is a values affirmation exercise. This is another technique that has been used quite extensively to help people feel like they belong. So why would that work? Let me just take you through what's done here, and this is exactly what it is. You can find this. I'm happy to send the website. The idea is that, and this has been done within healthcare settings, kind of corporate settings, college settings, and middle school. And the idea is that folks are invited to do this 15-minute writing exercise. They're given a list of values, things that they would really enjoy or see as parts of themselves, and they're asked to pick 2 or 3, and then they're asked to write about why they're important to you. It turns out that if you ask people to do this, especially times like before finals or before a big kind of transition, it really helps them to do well in difficult circumstances. So I'm just gonna read just a little bit about like the results of one of these kind of interventions. So this value affirmation helps people to kind of like re-key into their purpose and helps in terms of periods of stress. The results for a pretty big intervention, this was around 5,000 students, the intervention reduced the racial achievement gap by 30% in 5th through 7th grade. African American students who were randomly selected to this exercise had significantly higher GPAs, not only that year, but 2 years later. And those who benefited the most were the worst performing students. So the students that were most vulnerable to feeling like, I don't belong here, nobody really wants me here, I can't really do this, were the ones that actually responded the best when they were keyed into what they really, really value. And it had big implications. Again, we're talking about things that show up in terms of when that kids are persisting in the classroom. So these are just two particular types of interventions in terms of belonging. But I want to kind of talk about some of the challenges to belonging. One of which is that there are people experiencing, all of us in some way, shape, or form, at different levels of our own identity experience bias. There's this idea, does anyone know what the fundamental attribution error is? I heard someone say, yeah. You want to speak about it real quick? Or you want me to do it? Yeah. So just this idea, it's part of a broader kind of piece around social psychology about how, here's one way of explaining it. You ever see somebody walking and they trip and you're like, oh, that person must be so clumsy. But you trip and you're like, oh, what was that on the floor? I don't think it's anything about me. But when we see somebody else do it, we make it as a character kind of trait. So we've got this ability to know all the different reasons why I'm not clumsy. I'm also super clumsy. But like, I'm not clumsy, or this is not about me, or things like that. But we tend to see others as kind of groups. So this actually happens a lot as we're moving towards something we're going to talk about next, othering others. So making assumptions, broad-based assumptions about other people, which gets really involved in terms of whether or not I'm doing this kind of higher order task of understanding who that person is and whether or not they like me or whether or not they want me here. Turns out we've got tons of research to indicate we're really bad at that. We tend to, it's called the liking gap, we tend to assume that people like us less than they really do. Does that make sense? So imagine that, you're trying to enter into a space and think about whether or not you belong, but now I've got this bias that that person probably doesn't like me as much as they really do. This can accumulate and help us to not feel like we belong. The other kind of pieces that I want to kind of talk about is this kind of, and I mentioned this kind of critique. This is the cover of the book. And the idea is that these belonging interventions serve as a belonging to protect people from experiences of oppression and stress. But again, I think the idea here is, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't just equip people with umbrellas, but we actually created systems that kind of protected everybody. We had big, broad pavilions that stopped people from experiencing the rain. So it's a systems kind of question that's there. So I could go all the way off on that, but I'm going to pause and just think about there's some of the barriers to belonging that are really present, but this belonging kind of piece is kind of actually necessary before we move to our next part, which is about gotta feel like you belong to be part of a beloved community. But let me kind of pause. I'm gonna actually ask you all to kind of turn and talk to each other just for a minute, questions, thoughts, places of resonance, things like that, and then see if there's any questions. So talk to each other real quick. How did you make sense of that? Did that make sense? Just 1 minute. So just one more minute. All right, I'm going to jump into the conversation here and just see, are there any initial burning questions, thoughts, places of resonance, dissonance? Any questions, thoughts, comments about that? Yes, and let me, at this point, with the questions, get you all the mic. Oh, yeah, sure.
Well, Lexi and I were talking about.
Oh, is that on? Let me have it.
Lexi and I were talking about. We were both OLs and orientation leaders, and we were reflecting on what comments we might have said completely unintentionally that maybe made someone's experience more negative, and that how can we be constantly aware of like what we're saying and what like something that is in our subconsciously dropped, like, oh, I hate this, can
Yeah.
really have a huge impact on someone.
Yeah.
So we were just reflecting on that.
Yeah, I mean, so you're raising the idea and the wonderful opportunity that you all have with the kind of orientation. Sorry to have like put the pressure on you, like this is the moment, don't mess it up. But the benefit, there was a question over here later too. The benefit though is to think about this with, this is gonna have to stay here. The benefit though is the opportunity that you have at orientation to do a couple different things. One of which is to tell your own stories. So sometimes we have a sense of like, maybe I shouldn't tell them that, whatever. Actually telling your story is actually super helpful for the ways in which that people are gonna connect with your own kind of identities as well. And especially if you can find a story about how you kind of persisted. So it doesn't have to be like, everything's great, it's the perfect, it can just actually be like, that was super hard. And then if you are in a place of kind of offering, and this is what I learned, or I found out that other people went through this, or I wasn't the only one, that three-part piece, this is hard, it won't last forever, and it's not about you. So that's not about you, another way of kind of saying that is like, other people go through this. There's a great example of the book, and I don't know if this is the same thing kind of here, but they have this example of the book about how many folks go to college, the beds are longer than I don't know if it's like that anymore, but they used to be like, I don't know why it used to happen, they're like 8 feet long, right? And so a lot of kids would come, and so this guy tells a story about how he came to college with his sheets from home. And he was already having a hard time, he couldn't figure out where he was going, and he finally gets to his room, and he tries to put the sheets on the bed, and he's like, and even my sheets didn't fit. And I had the sense of like, clearly I don't belong here. Until his roommate was like, mine don't either. It turned out everybody had that kind of problem of not having the sheets fit, so he was able to interpret it differently, if that makes sense. So it's not that we all literally have to have the same sheet fitting issue, but the opportunity within orientation is to be able to tell your stories of struggle as well. So not to overburden you all with the responsibility of like, how did you mess it up? I actually would think about it the other way, which is the more that you actually tell the stories of like, yeah, that happens, that can be really helpful. And to normalize that coming to school is a big transition. It's something that's different, or getting ready for finals for the first time, or I don't know, working for the first time. There's a number of opportunities for those transitions. Yeah, thanks. Another question? Yeah, now I can bring this over to you. Sorry to task you with this, it's just.
I think a question that thrived onto me is you discuss a lot about how previous psychologists in their studies, they use college students to kind of see the first intervention. One thing I was curious, especially when we think of like administrators or hierarchical scale, of how maybe we continue that intervention, and hearing your opinion on how to continue that, because a lot of people think once we turn adults and get into our workforce, we're already belong, we don't face into any more interference, and how maybe that administrative level could continue into intergenerational kind of story sharing and that sort.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful way of thinking about like all of us at the different times and places within our lives could benefit from senses of belonging, and not forgetting that perhaps we also struggled with belonging before. So actually that's one of the things that I get to do in my job now. So my title is as diversity lead or director of diversity, equity, inclusion for student life at University of Washington. My entire job is administration facing. All I do is teach and train and support and do consultation about this. And what comes up is, I've never worked in student affairs before. I don't know if I belong here. Or what does it mean to be, a person on campus doing a lot of work but not within academia? It's the same questions. We're doing the same kind of things. In terms of the research there, we don't have as much, but it's emerging, especially within healthcare and other organizations, that people could use a dose of belonging. There's another piece that I think comes up around this, and this is a place of a critique, is like, do you have to feel like you belong everywhere all the time? And the answer simply to that is no. That we have places that we choose to belong, or would like to belong, or we'd like to have that feeling, but the idea that like every single place all the time is not necessary. The other kind of piece is agency. So what happens with the kind of kids that I often work with, or schools, is schools and elementary schools and high schools are kind of panicked around kids' sense of kind of belonging. Do they feel like they belong? Kids get to choose. That sometimes they want to belong to this club or that place. How do we kind of listen to what people would like to do, where they would like to kind of go as well? And the same thing is, as we get older, where do we want to choose to belong? And how do we make sense of that? Awesome. Other question around belonging? So this idea kind of around belonging, and again, this invitation for us to think a little bit about like small tweaks that help us belong, is going to lead us to our next kind of piece, which is this idea around beloved community. So I'm really curious about what beloved community means to you all. And yes, again, you have to talk to your friends. So turn to each other. There's about 2 more times you have to do this. But what is beloved community? What does that even mean? So turn to each other. If you're tired of the person next to you, it's okay. You can like go across the aisle. Okay, I'll interrupt the conversations again. So I want to kind of point out, and I'm really excited about this, that there's actually a D.I.D. wall. What do you call it? D.I.D. wall? D.I.D. wall outside that has this as a question. And so I got a chance to kind of take a look as to what was already out there. I want to invite folks to kind of go write some of your answers as well. But I'm really curious, just popcorn style, and again, I'll repeat it for the mic, but what does beloved community mean to you? What kind of comes to mind when you think about that? What does it feel like? What does it mean to you? Yes?
We were saying it was mentioned earlier, where you can feel like your most authentic self, and also we were saying it's familiar to you. So that's that sort of aspect.
Mm-hmm. So I hear that it's familiar to you and you can be your most authentic self. So in fact, we're starting to define beloved community by invoking what it feels like to belong, right? So these things kind of come together. Awesome, thank you. Other folks, yeah? Did you say earnest camaraderie? Yeah. So that has a weight to it, right? Like a true sense of friendship and camaraderie in a community, right? This idea of love. Beautiful, thank you. Anyone else? Well, let's talk a little bit about the history of the beloved community. So it was a term actually used by some of Martin Luther King's mentors. So comes and kind of has a history, and I want to defer to any historians that know more about this or other folks to definitely correct me, because I'm new in my learning with this. But as I understand it, 2 of his kind of mentors and part of the kind of Black liberation and Baptists and other kind of historical, I wouldn't say theologians, preachers were kind of talking about this idea about beloved community. And then Martin Luther King spent a lot of time talking about and thinking about the beloved community and talking about the conditions by which it needs to be created. So there's a famous speech in which he kind of states this, which is the aftermath of nonviolence is the creation of the beloved community. The aftermath of nonviolence is redemption. The aftermath of nonviolence is reconciliation, and the aftermath of violence is emptiness and bitterness. So this is really part of his longer conversation about the nonviolent movement. And to dive into the kind of principles of the nonviolence that he was really talking about, we have to kind of remember that what he's really kind of talking about, and in particular, I can kind of put this up as well, is that he's invoking particular principles of nonviolence that are pretty tough to make work. So, and none of my slides are up the right way. Let me just see if I have it. I have the principles kind of up here. So if we take a look at the kind of principles, and this is from the King Center, they're pretty intense and they're hard to do. But the principles of the nonviolence way of life is that it takes courage and that it seeks to win friendships and understanding. And this is with people who do not like you. This is with people who want to take away your freedoms. This is very explicitly about reaching out across divides with people who undermine your humanity. The idea is to actually seek friendship. And it seeks to defeat injustice and evil, but not people. It also, it holds that earned voluntary suffering for a just cause can educate people. So this is about, and these principles were actually practiced. So people might think about like the sit-ins, right? And the sitting in at the counters, right? That folks were actually trained to deal with vitriol and violence. So this is, I want to articulate this kind of movement because this is actually beyond what we talk about in the field of bridging differences. This is extraordinary. This takes a lot of courage and patience, and it's about converting other people to your thoughts and thoughts of justice. It also believes that nonviolence believes that the universe is on the side of justice. So in other words, it's going to take a while. It's going to take a moment. It's going to take a lot. So these were some of the principles underneath. So to think about these principles, these are the ones that are underneath what Martin Luther King is talking about in the creation of the beloved community. He also talks about the creation of the beloved community as one that is just, where people don't experience hunger or poverty or discrimination. So this is a really elaborated and thoughtful kind of articulation of beloved community, and just to kind of think about where the history kind of comes from. There's another person who's talked a lot about beloved community, and that is Bell Hooks. And so I want to talk a little bit about, actually, I don't want to do it, I'm going to let her do it. Talk a little bit about what beloved community means, according to Bell Hooks. And I'm going to show you about 2 minutes of a video. This is Bell Hooks in conversation with Cornel West. And so I don't know what happened before this video, and I don't know what the context is, but I want to give you a preview that just before this, they had been fighting. They had been having an argument. And you're going to see it kind of coming down out of that argument, but just notice, and I want you to pay attention to, imagine you're getting ready to present with folks you love and respect, but you just fought.
I mean, partially Cornel and I are going to address some of the difficulties of where we begin with beloved community. I haven't seen Cornel for a while, and the first thing I said to him today was, I still love you, because for the first time since I have known Cornel, I feel significant political differences with him as I go around. And it's been interesting to me because it was very difficult for me, because he has been such a comrade and is such a comrade, to disagree with him and to be public about saying, I don't agree with something he said. And I think that that goes to the heart of how we often conceptualize community wrongly and beloved community wrongly, which is that we do not have a space for disagreement, and that disagreement means somehow the end of love, and not that it's the beginning of a fuller, deeper, richer love.
Very much so, very much so. Would you like me to read this quote that you
We
asked
were
me
going to
read?
start reading a quote from
Because,
Martin Luther King.
Yeah, we think this is an appropriate starting place, other than saying that we're glad to be here. It's always a joyous occasion for me to be here with my comrade and colleague and sister, Bell Hooks, I must say. I was talking about how much I love Bell Hooks. And I'd like to thank Brother Thomas Michelson for his visionary leadership of this institution for bringing us together. But we thought it would be crucial to begin with this quote from Brother Martin Luther King, Jr. This is from his speech, Where Do We Go From Here? Martin says, I have decided to love. Major decision. If you are seeking the highest good, I think you can find it through love. And the beautiful thing is that we are moving wrong when we do not do it, because John was right, God is love. He who hates, and this is Martin saying he who hates does not know God, but he who has love has the key that unlocks the door to the meaning of ultimate reality. That's from Martin.
I have decided to love. If you're seeking the highest good, I think you can find it through love. And the beautiful thing is that we're moving wrong when we don't do it, because John was right. God is love. She who hates does not know God, but she who has love has the key that unlocks the door to the meaning of ultimate reality.
And
Okay, this is your last turn and talk. What did you think about that? What did you hear? What came up? So last turn and talk, what came up as you heard these folks talk about what beloved community is and the role of conflict? Let's turn to each other real quick. All right. I'm going to come on back to this conversation. Sounds like it was a good one, lots of thoughts. So we're going to come on back to this, but I wanted to use this as a place of provocation, a place for us to think a little bit. Because we've kind of gone from this place of kind of belonging to beloved community. We've gone from, this place of like, what does it take to help people feel like they belong? But one of the things that doesn't often get narrated, or perhaps maybe it does, but I don't hear it often, is the role of conflict. That actually heat and conflict and disagreement is a piece that needs to be present. As Bell Hooks, says, is that, the idea is that the conflict is not the end of love, but maybe it's actually the kind of the start, or the ways of kind of engaging. So I want to take us from, again, I want to articulate it, my understanding relationship in terms of nonviolence communication, the nonviolent principles, is an extraordinary amount of integrity, love, work, and practice to do the types of things that Martin Luther King and other folks did, in terms of how to confront others, how they were subject to their own physical threat. And I also want to kind of think about this in the context of it is a way and not the only way, but it is a way that has shown up in terms of principles of nonviolent communication. It is one that undergirds our notion of beloved community. And it's also, one that has conflict as a piece of inevitability there. But I want to move to, yes?
When you talk about conflict, I agree with you. I really love conflict.
Yeah.
But could you talk a little bit about the nuances of enjoying conflict, but not making it conflict about the person? Because I witness and feel that a lot, that, this person disagrees with me, now that person must be bad.
Yes.
So what about conflict is good, and where does it turn the line that it's actually not that love that Martin
Yeah. So if I hear it right, and I'm just going to say it again, is the idea, like, you're asking about the distinction about, like, when does conflict go wrong? And when does it, I hear you also speaking to, like, when does it move to the kind of personalization of that person's bad?
Yeah.
So I would love to be able to delineate that for all kinds of reasons, because I think we'd all be better off if we knew what the line was. I don't know what the line is, but I know someone who does, which is Amanda Ripley, has an amazing book called High Conflict that actually talks about the ways in which, and she runs an organization called Good Conflict. And she's a journalist, and she trains journalists to listen and to lean in and to kind of cultivate kind of enough heat to get good stories and good reporting, and also works to not cross the line into high conflict. And so she actually describes high conflict as that kind of like, what's a good analogy? Like almost like I'm going between black, I'm terrible with metaphors, I'm gonna mess it up. A snowball. I'm from Hawaii, so I'm gonna mess this up. I understand like snowballs roll downhill and pick up speed and get bigger and bigger and bigger. So the idea that kind of like sometimes a conflict can start off, but it kind of picks up and gets larger and larger. I don't know if that's only in cartoons, but y'all feel me, right? Like that's the idea. It picks up speed. So it becomes high conflict when it picks up so much speed that no one's getting anything done, or violence ensues, or othering. So the piece that you're kind of talking about as well is othering. So we think about othering just as simple as that, which is to see another person not as a person, but as an other. And what happens in the terms of high conflict is that that other person becomes dehumanized. They are no longer a person. Fundamental attribution error is a little bit of a piece of that we talked about. Oh, they're a clumsy person. Oh, they're a bad person. Now we're making entire generalized statements about the personhood. So it's one of those things that catches up speed, right? And we're in a time and an era of toxic polarization. Times where conflict and othering are really high. We feel that ourselves. We've got a lot of evidence to suggest that within the United States and other places that we're experiencing higher and higher rates of polarization, meaning that the likelihood to see people as other, especially as we begin fusing identities together. It used to be 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago that political identity and whether or not you were a good person weren't as synonymous. It was a thing. Or political identity and racial identity weren't synonymous in the same kind of ways. We're in a different place where the kind of assumptions around identities are kind of merged and are polarized kind of space. We're also in a time and space, and we hear this from undergraduates. So a recent study done by CDI, the Constructive Dialogue Institute, and a number of others found that anywhere between 60 to 75% of undergraduates felt like they couldn't be their whole selves on campus for fear. And there was a fear of actually engaging in conflict as well. If I show them who I really am, I won't be liked. I'll be canceled. I'll be doxxed. Those are things that actually happen. So we're in a time period that's really kind of moving us toward this polarization, and where the lines of kind of conflict, I think, are getting blurry and drawn in different ways. Let me come back to you. Does that make sense? Or okay. So, and this is kind of what we want to talk about in terms of this next kind of piece. So, which is, I'm part of a group of folks at the Greater Good Science Center, and what we do at UC Berkeley Greater Good Science Center is we're really about kind of making the social science of well-being, of getting along, available to everybody. And we started this work, the Greater Good Science Center started this work 1,000 years ago, it feels like, actually by funding me and funding my work on how kids understand race and prejudice and bias. So we've really done, they now have like this, now I think a lot of people kind of assume Greater Good Science Center is like this Berkeley woo-woo positive psychology place. And it also has this history of kind of like science and study of prejudice and bias. And one of the things that has kind of come about is that we've been engaged in the science of bridging differences. So what does it take to connect across our differences? And I want to be really clear. This is the small science about connecting across our differences. This is not the same as changing people's mind. This is not the same as the amazing and necessary work that Martin Luther King did. This is smaller but necessary, and also smaller, and we find a lot of folks don't have these skills. So what we do here, and I do think this is related to belonging and other community, is that we've got a couple of principles. I'm sorry that you can't really see this here. But we have got a couple principles, and the science is really, really good here about what does it take for us to connect across our differences, and I'll take you through this really quickly. We have got two foundations. If we kind of, I told you I'm bad with analogies, so I'm gonna work this bridging analogy really hard. We've got these two kind of pillars. On one side is this foundation of presence. And we can think about this a couple different ways. Mindfulness, groundedness, prayerfulness. It's whatever it takes us before we're engaged in kind of a conflict or conversation to breathe and get connected. And so for some of us, that's with a prayer. For some of us, that's with a breath work. For some of us, that's like feeling our feet on the ground. Whatever it is that is the start. So much evidence that actually mindfulness practice, prayer, those kinds of pieces help. On the other side is this kind of advanced skill of bringing folks together and creating spaces of belonging. And what does it take to actually really do that? That's some of the belonging science. But in between are these other kinds of pieces, one of which is we have to know what bridging differences is. And the main caveat with that is that what it's not. It's not debate, it's not conversion, and it doesn't require you to give up your own humanity. These are small skills about connecting. Just how would I talk to and listen to someone who's really different than me? Lots of evidence around listening that we have to be trained and practice. When I say trained, it doesn't mean like you have to go take a course. You just got to be practiced at really listening. And there's certain types of listening, like active listening. There's a whole bunch of different ways we could talk about dialogue, but active listening is just engaged listening where you're really working on making sure that you're understanding what the person is saying. Storytelling. Then you've got to be equipped to tell your own story. So we talked about, for example, within the belonging, how can I tell a story? And I think about this often as I'm working with folks who are coming on campus for the first time to tell the story that says, transitions are hard, this won't last forever, and it's not about you. How do we tell and craft that story? Also with the storytelling is how do we offer kind of compassion to ourselves as we're telling stories of our own hurt and pain. Reducing misperceptions. Tons of research on this, social psychological research that shows, and some of the kind of interesting piece around this, there's been recent research to find like what helps open people's minds up, and it turns out like actually watching videos of people interact across their differences helps. That modeling, watching, there's a pretty famous kind of 8-minute commercial that actually shows people connecting across their differences, that when they showed people this commercial, they had more likelihood to want to engage with people that were different than them. So media, storytelling, lots of things like that. This is also where we start thinking about things like implicit bias, like understanding and thinking about implicit bias. Common humanity. So what do we do to help identify shared values, shared identities, and shared interests? So if I have to bring together a bunch of people who are really different and don't like each other, how do I actually help them to identify shared goals, shared interests, shared values? Tons of research on this kind of piece too, kind of the old school kind of psychology research around, people heard of like the robber's cave experiment and things like that. The idea about like bringing people together to solve a problem. So I'm just kind of went through about 400 studies worth of science in 1 minute. In other words, there's a lot here. There are lots of little things that we can do. And I really wanted to kind of move to the end of the kind of presentation by thinking about, we've got a lot of tools that we can use, a lot of small tools that we can use, that we can kind of get practice. And then we can also create kind of situations that allow us to do that as well. So in a time of incredible toxic polarization and struggle and strife and heat, people often ask me, like, why do I do this work? It's because this type of work helps me be really hopeful about the small practices and things that we can kind of do to create belonging, to connect across our differences, and hopefully get to a place of creating beloved community. So I could go on, but I would much prefer to be in dialogue with you all. So I'm gonna go ahead and pause here, and then it's time to invite folks for questions, comments, pushback, conflict, mild conflict. You know, I can't take too much. But no, honestly, I'm really interested in hearing from folks just a little bit about what you all think. But that's the formal end to my presentation. So we have about 15, 20 minutes to be in conversation. So I'd love to hear comments, thoughts, questions.
Okay. We're going to use the microphones because there's a recording going on. So thanks.
So you're a child psychologist, and I'm picturing you working with children
Yeah.
On a fairly regular basis. How have your years working with them infused and informed your philosophy? Like, what have you learned? There's the studies, there's all that like quantitative data, but what have they taught you?
Yeah. Oh, I'm so appreciative for that question. And you know, I do these types of talks a lot and never gotten that question. So I just want to pause and be like, thank you for asking a question, because kids animate, like, that's why I do the things that I do. Is all about kind of being in the service of kids. And it's also the place where I feel like, I'm gonna go fully on my kind of soapbox here. I feel like kids have it the worst. I think they're the ones that are most impacted by our dysfunction as adults and the systems. And so how does it impact me? Because I get to see and talk and listen to kids that are impacted by all the things that are going on around them. And how does it shape my kind of perspective? Kids are about understanding, listening to kids is about understanding change and development, and most of all, capacity for hope and change. Like, kids get to learn a thing, and I get to kind of see that, or change their mind, or become different people. It's just capacity and resilience. So it gives me tremendous hope. Like, I've been identified as being pathologically optimistic, but it's because I serve children. So it gives me a lot of hope. And I think it helps me to do really hard work, like spending lots of time with people that hate each other, or serving people that are impacted by trauma. My specialty is child trauma, which also means my specialty is watching kids survive and thrive after the unimaginable. So just to get fully into it, like I'm really arrogant about this. It's the best thing. I feel like I've got the best job serving and listening to kids. I feel blessed for the opportunity. So yeah, I don't know if that's what you're looking for. I got super deep really quick, but it informs everything I do, and it gives me hope, and reminds me that we're gonna change and grow, and development's a thing. Like, I'm in perimenopause right now. That's a developmental stage. I hope, that will end and shift. Like, we change, we do things all the time. So yeah. I know I killed the conversation with perimenopause, but that's all right. Okay, right there. Questions, thoughts? Yes, I see one over here.
So I just have a question about common humanity. So I feel like that is a good place to have a common ground when engaging in conflict with someone. So I'm wondering if you would agree, and also how to implement practices of that, and how can you really teach that practice, I guess?
Yeah. So it turns out to be, yes, I agree. And it turns out to be a pretty elaborate process. I think we've probably all been in an argument, or have all maybe even said, well, we're all just human. We're all just human, the invocation of like, we're all just human, ain't it? Because it's not elaborate, it's not depth, it's not earnest, it doesn't really get us there. We need to do more. So what does that really mean? So it means that I have to be able to sit across from someone who really disagrees and think about the ways in which they are a person and a human. So I'm gonna give you a really super random study, but it's one of my favorite. There's a study that's done that brought people to kind of together and asked them to kind of think about a person who they're in disagreement with or they're in conflict with. And to imagine, to go through this meditation, to imagine whether or not they like carrots or broccoli. And to do some thinking, like, I think you're a carrot person, right? The idea is that was an elaborated thinking that got me out of, this is a bad person who's against me, but this is a person who eats carrots, or maybe doesn't like either, or is an actual person. So it turns out that type of research, that type of idea, which is engaging in a practice of really literally trying to make that person human. So thinking about like, do they put their pants on both feet, one at a time? Do they wear shoes in the house or not? Little things like that actually are about making a person becomes part of this elaborate process of seeing them as human, and moves towards reducing that kind of dehumanization. Dehumanization, again, we can kind of talk about that as well, is a very kind of well-documented process that's kind of, I'm gonna say necessary, but definitely involved in the ways in which we harm folks, right? And we can see it in things with language, with propaganda, with the ways in which a history of kind of racism and exclusion have relied upon using terms that are like animal-like. That it's a purposeful process that goes on that stops us from seeing other people as people. So there are forces out there that are doing that. So this is a complicated process, but possible. I mean, it's possible. I lead folks through a meditation around imagining people eating carrots or broccoli. And it turns out the research, again, around that does show that it works. Let me come back to you because I nerded out and I'm not sure if I answered your question. Did that answer, or are you looking for something different?
Yeah, no, yeah, that was very helpful.
Yeah. And there's lots of other kind of work that's out there that's around what does it take to kind of create common humanity and empathy and compassion and things like that. Yeah.
With a system like bridging differences, I'm wondering, so I imagine one of the kind of expected outcomes, if this is successful, kind of attitudinal changes. I'm wondering, are there any kind of associated behavioral changes that you expect to see? Like, for people who bridge differences, is there more willingness to compromise in the face of conflict? Or, you know, you said it's not about changing minds, but I'm wondering, is there any kind of behavioral indicator that you look into, like, success?
Yeah, so I love the question. So what we're doing with this, and we're starting to kind of study this a little bit. So what we're kind of doing here, for better or for worse, is taking individual skills that have been demonstrated to change attitudes and sometimes behavior. Depends on which of these skills we're actually talking about. So some of them we've got greater evidence for, like there's a whole kind of piece here around like intergroup kind of process that we kind of work with Linda Trop and other folks on about like that you can actually shift behavior sometimes. But we're taking all of these different kind of studies and different kind of practices and we're kind of throwing them together and hoping a bit. And we just did our first empirical study on this using a measure. And so what I did is I worked with 165 Climate Corps volunteers. So these are adults who are engaged in a year-long process of learning about climate and climate stewardship. And we took them through a 14-hour course here. So we had some initial evidence that people who came in low on attitudes of openness, willingness to befriend, things like that, did move up attitude-wise. We didn't have a ton of behavioral indicators as of yet, but so it looks like we can move folks on low. Now, we got more complicated. The folks in the middle and the folks in the high didn't really change. We also did this, and this is interesting and also kind of shoots my work in the foot. We compared a group who were doing not this course, but a course on climate stewardship. They had the same movement. So then we had to dig into why. Like, I'm doing all my special science stuff, and they're learning about trees. Turns out that the climate stewardship course was about how to talk to people to get them to understand that climate change is real. So we're still kind of learning. So in terms of like this amalgamation of stuff, we don't know yet in terms of the behavioral. It does seem many of these things are a little bit resistant to the behavioral. There's a number of factors. Attitudinal changes we're getting a bit more of, and the behavior things in terms of what I would be looking for, I'd be looking for people that are more likely to spend time talking to others. That would be what I would be looking for. I have anecdotal evidence to suggest that people who go through this type of training and are bridging kind of courses, especially in higher ed campuses, are telling me that they're spending more time feeling like they can engage in conflict, that they're not averse to do so, and they feel helped and supported to have difficult dialogue. So that's what I'm seeing kind of anecdotally. Does that make sense? Yeah, but I'd love to talk more about that. But yeah, the idea too is like, I don't want this to be, I'll say this, like, I don't want this to be another kind of like DARE program. Y'all are probably too young to know about DARE. Y'all remember DARE? So DARE was a big program in the 1980s when I grew up. It was like DARE to say no to drugs. It got tons of money, lots of funding, was built on these kind of premises that like just kind of make sense, but didn't work at all. But was really, really funded. So I don't want to do a lot of stuff that makes sense, but doesn't work at all. So that's what keeps me up at night is that part.
Hello. Hi. So I think it's sort of a fact that there's obviously a lot of fear in our society, and I think that a lot of the hate that we find is sort of like bred from that fear. And the sort of sad but true thing about it is that to fall for fear is like really simple. Like it's really easy, especially in the age of like phones, social media, and folks who are, have these big names that are trying to sort of like shove that agenda at us. So the question, I guess, is like, this is a great program, of course, and I fully support it, and I think it's great. It seems sort of like a challenge to sort of get people on board with it, especially folks who are susceptible to fall for fear of this group or fear of that or fear of people who don't look and sound like me. And that is so clear to me. And I've also seen it in my own life with family and friends and stuff like that. And so the core of the question, I guess, is like, how do we actually make that work when our society has become so fractured now with social media and how fast misinformation can spread and hate can spread? So that is sort of a big question, and it's very loaded, but it is something I think about frequently, so I felt like I should ask.
Yeah. I wish I had the answer, right? Like if I had the answer, I'd be like, we're good, right? But I don't think I have the answer. I think many of us in community with different approaches have the answer. And I think if we really have a beloved community that leans into our assets, our resources, our skills, then we could kind of craft an answer. I also, I wholeheartedly agree around the fear. And I think there are things that make fear more available to us, whether that's what we're kind of consuming in terms of the media, what we're kind of seeing. And, fear really pays. Like one of the things that I make my kids ask is, who's making money off of your fear? Someone's making money off of it. Someone's literally commodified your fear. And also and so we think about this idea of conflict entrepreneurs. So there are people that are really making money and really getting power and really literally capitalizing upon your fear. And so we have some evidence to suggest that when young folks become really aware about the ways in which they're being profited off of, that they tend to resist. So for example, one of the things that was most successful around tobacco cessation were kind of getting young folks involved in understanding the tobacco industry and how much money they were making off of them. And that kind of organized folks to kind of make some change. Like, I choose not to give my money to this person. There's that kind of piece. So I think making people aware of the kind of fear, thinking critically about who's kind of making money off of your fear and who's winning off of your fear. Like, why would it be helpful to folks to, to make some groups of folks not like each other? I mean, we've got lots of evidence to suggest in our 2 previous rounds of elections that we had outside interference that was using racialized language to get people to be scared of each other. So I think the critical analysis that you've already kind of framed is a way. I do think the other ways are, okay, so if it's fear, then I should breathe a little. I should probably take a breath. I should do some more mindfulness. I know what I do in the context of fear is like I pray. So I need to kind of invoke a higher, so those are the ways in which some of these kind of pieces might be helpful. The other thing I'll say, and I'll end on this part, I think we need to have an industry that really supports and gives lots of examples of the ways in which we overcome our fears every day. That many of us have actually done work to overcome our fears. And why is that not highlighted, capitalized, kind of talk about? We do have emerging evidence, great work that's done by More in Common, an organization that found this work called kind of tribes, kind of identify the different political kind of spaces. The majority of people within the United States fell into one category, and that category was called the exhausted majority. And the majority of folks were not indicating that they hated this person and they hated that, they were just kind of tired of it all. So I actually think there are ways that we can kind of get together and make some of this more visible. And I'll just say this, I've been in this kind of bridging differences, toxic polarization kind of work for the past 2 years. So I'm relatively new to it, but I'm always shocked at how many folks are really in the fight against this polarization. I wish we knew more of that and had more stories of people that are collaborating. I've had more opportunity in my span doing this work to work with people that are, I would say, politically opposite from me. But to do so and to find some common ground, not that I endorse or But I've had more of those examples, and I think I feel really privileged to have that space, and I wish we had more of it. Because the fact of the matter is that people are doing scary stuff every day across our differences. It's just that that's not what's going to get a click. Yeah. I'm throwing all kinds of shade out there, so if folks want to,
So we've got an opportunity now to have our reception, but will folks join me in thanking Dr. Briscoe-Smith? We appreciate having you here today.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks for the questions.